One of the challenges that museums have is how do you organise your objects? One way of organising them is by function, which is probably the most common thing. Sometimes museums organise things by age, but things fall through the cracks. And another way of looking at things is maybe thinking, could you organise things on an A to Z basis? Now, really today, obviously it's the Hawley Collection we're talking about. I know some people know a lot about the Hawley Collection, but I'm just going to say a little bit about it. So the Hawley Collection is a collection that was collected by a chap called Ken Hawley. He ran a tool shop, and he once went to demonstrate an electric plane at a coffin maker's. And hanging on the wall, there was a brace. And he basically said, I've never seen one of them. Can I have it? And Ken spent 30 years going round Sheffield, basically saying, can I have it? And he had a Volvo, which was, you know, big car, and I sometimes jokingly say he had a big coat as well. And some places he went back over and over again, and essentially filled his house with stuff. And, you know, the attics, the sheds, the whole place. And I think there was a point where obviously that became too much. So I don't know what his wife actually said, but at some point he got given a building by the university, which was called the Hawley Building, which was down on Mappin Street, but there was no public access. And what Ken started to do there was to catalogue his collection. And he had a group of volunteers, most of whom had worked in the industry, and he set about that task. In 2013, there was a bit of a choice going on. One possibility was Ken's collection could have ended up in the Millennium Galleries. I think I'm really grateful that didn't happen, because actually that would have been quite a limited space, and it also would have meant the collection would have had to have been stored off-site. So the advantage was 2013, we came down here, and so we've got public access, and everything in the collection is here. There's none anywhere else. Well, there is some in one other place, but I won't mention that. But generally, everything is here, and it's almost as if, you know, any of these objects or any other objects, if you actually thought, oh, I really want to see the original there, or something similar to it, you know, essentially, if you came in one day, rang a doorbell, one of our volunteers would help you access that. We think the collection is of the order of 100,000 items. We don't know, and we're nearly at a milestone, because we've nearly catalogued 49,000 items. But, you know, to illustrate the sort of gap, last week we were looking at scissors for somebody, and we started looking on the catalogue for the scissors, and they all had the same number. The reason they all had the same number, it was the number of the box. In the box, there was 50 pairs of scissors, most of which were slightly different. So, you know, we have boxes with things, and also people are constantly giving us donations. So, and as well as sort of physical objects, we've got maps, we've got books, we've got a library, we've got loads of photographs, we've got documents about companies. Some of these, you know, in a way, this talk is giving you a flavour of the range of things that's in the Hawley Collection. And I do understand that thing where you can go and open a box and think nobody's been in this box for 13 years, and you might find something in it that's significantly different or unusual. So essentially, this talk matches up to an exhibition that we've got over in the gallery. And when somebody designed the gallery, they designed this space for us to have an A to Z of items. And in the time I've been involved, we've had an A to Z of hammers, because we probably have the biggest collection of hammers in the world. We've had an A to Z of planes. We've probably got the biggest collection of planes in the world. We have some other biggest collections. We have the biggest collection of saws in the world, but actually you'd struggle to get a saw in one of those boxes. So every now and again, there is the opportunity to change things. And again, it's another delight of working for the Hawley Collection. We're all volunteers, and that in some other organisations, if you said, I'd like to do an exhibition about something, you'd probably be told, no, you can't. You've got to wear white gloves, or you've got to plan it 3 or 4 years in advance. But actually, any Hawley volunteer who's got a good idea they'd like to follow up related to collection has the opportunity to do that. So Peter and Bob decided that they were going to do an A to Z of the Hawley Collection, and there it is. I was lucky as they were putting it in. I had the foresight to think, hang on a minute, before you put the glass in, I want to take a photograph. Because another challenge sometimes is just taking photographs through the glass. So an award. And it's interesting, that really just struck me. Put your hands up if you've got a City and Guilds qualification. There was something about City and Guilds that, in a sense, they weren't sort of mainstream education. You know, they weren't GCSEs, they weren't A-levels, they weren't O-levels, but what they were, you know, they were recognised skills qualifications that had a sort of high standard, and behind that there would have been a sort of moderation and an assessment and looking at everything there. And so this was awarded to a chap, I'll read his name out, give him the credit for it, Peter Hillman in 1966. Yeah, you see it on there. And it was a plastering award. And again, when somebody comes to do the plastering, I don't know about you, but I stand back in awe and see them, see them do it, see them working it. They normally walk out covered in plaster, but actually, they've done a really good job. And now the other thing we've got on here, we've got a brand, which is Tyzax. It's interesting. I had a bit of a look at the 7 different tool companies in Sheffield called Tyzax. So Tyzax is really quite a good Sheffield name. And the other thing you can probably see, you could have been mistaken for thinking this has come from the Isle of Man, because it's got that 3-legged logo of the Isle of Man. And it's not a coincidence, because Tyzax actually had a deal with the Isle of Man, and they were providing cutlery for people who lived in the Isle, for companies that worked in the Isle of Man. And people have heard me talk before. It's a bit of a challenge in Sheffield. You've got 1,600 cutlery companies. You've got probably another 800 tool companies, and they all want a logo. So there's a need for differentiation of 2,500 logos. So you can imagine a company comes up with a logo and can't have that. Somebody else has got it. So a real bit of a challenge there. But essentially we've got a top award, we've got a top manufacturer, and we've got a top product. B. Now, this is quite appropriate, really. I mean, I know Sheffield's the snooker capital of the world, but I mean, there was a point where actually billiards, I suspect, was a more popular game than snooker. And this is actually one of our mystery items, and Mike, one of our volunteers, has very kindly put a snooker cue in there. And this was essentially all about levelling up a snooker cue. It was about getting an absolute flat end to a snooker cue so that you could then put the chalk bit on the end that you see them already polishing up. And it's got no maker on it, this. We've inquired with the National Billiards Association, and they know nothing about it. So this is it could be a one-off creative item made by somebody in Sheffield to help with cleaning the end of a cue and as a grinding tool. So I say it's quite nice to have this as a Sheffield item. There's sort of 2 opportunities in this talk to mention billiard balls, okay? And if you've played pool, snooker, billiards, whatever, you take these slightly for granted. As a result of some work I did on an earlier talk, what were billiard balls originally made of? Ivory. Because the sharp end of an elephant's tusk is solid. The blunt end, if you like, is hollow. So, I know it's a bit of a shame elephants got killed, but in the past, one of the reasons, which isn't top of most people's list, is they're actually used to make billiard balls rather than anything else. Right, a cartridge filler. So that notion that if you're going to go shooting, you want essentially you want your cartridges to work. And if they're going to blow up in your gun, that could have pretty dire consequences. But I think the interesting thing is that this was shooting was a very popular pastime across the rich and famous in Sheffield. Quite a lot of the cutlers were certainly involved in that pastime, and I guess lots of the other industrialists would be too. And some of them even sort of set up their own regiments or their own shooting organisations. And essentially, Sheffield was making goods to support the whole of the country. So actually, the whole of the shooting industry in the country possibly was using goods that were made in Sheffield. If you look in the back of a James Dixon catalogue, there's a massive cartridge machine that I think, in like 1850, 1860, cost a lot of money. And so making sure your shotgun cartridge was actually full and was able to work. A funny thing was something else that was made in Sheffield was powder flasks. And there was a point where they didn't need powder flasks anymore. But after the Second World War, when all the American GIs were here, James Dixon actually started remaking powder flasks because all these American GIs were coming to Sheffield saying, I want a powder flask to take home to the wild country. Right, D, a domestic bean slicer. Now, this is just, it's interesting, that whole notion of, we've got things related to cutlery, we've got things related to trades, and, it's a little bit like every home should have one of these. Spong's number 638 bean slicer this is, and it's, I'm just going to read a little bit out here. Here's an easy way to cut beans. Just feed them into the slots of the ingenious machine and turn the handle. Every turn gives you 8 even slices, quick as lightning, simple as ABC. And you could have that for 2 shillings and 9 pence. These are other things that were made by Spong's that we've also dug out. So, I look at this one, Spong's 601 mincer, And then it says, making your Christmas pudding and pies. You know, none of that buying your sort of pre-prepared mince and everything. You know, you had to make your own. And I certainly recognise this object for, you know, getting the shredded bits for marmalade. But they are a sort of relic of the past, and I'm sure there are people who are making their own produce who sometimes might think, oh, well, you know, we might go back and use some of these things because they actually work and they actually do the business. One of the issues for the Hawley collection, and we haven't resolved this issue at all, is when do we stop collecting? You know, we've certainly got some things in the collection that might have been made in the 1600s, 1700s. But, you know, this is an electronic device in the 1980s. I think it's badged as Stanley. And essentially, it was for measuring the distance. You know, when you're selling your house and a surveyor comes around and they want to measure how quick the rooms were, obviously, there's just a certain point where they did it with a tape measure. Then there's a point where you've got electronic devices, worked on sort of like ultrasound, a bit like the gadget on your car when you're parking. So that's what this was. The other thing is, if we contrast it with the items we just saw beforehand, if you had one of these beam cutters, you wouldn't be replacing it the next year for a new model and the next year for a new model after that. But I would imagine, you know, items now change very, very quickly. You know, I've got an iPhone 12, but I'm feeling precious to get an iPhone 15 because it's got a better camera on it. And so we've got items that are, you know, more rapidly changing. Essentially, the Hawley collection had lots of things that were made in Sheffield, but some of these things were not made in Sheffield. And I suppose Ken was actually making a decision, oh, that's different, I'll collect it. But it is a real issue. Flower power. When I saw this, I was thinking, I'm not sure about this, because I've got something very similar, which I forgot to bring today, which are actually grape scissors. So another thing we definitely have in the collection, we have large numbers of scissors, which we haven't catalogued. Okay, and essentially, I don't know, I'm sure we've got at least 100, 200 different sorts of scissors. And if you look at a catalogue of a cutlery maker, and of course scissors are cutlery because they're cut, you'll see quite a range there. But it's interesting, one of the things about Ken's collection is every now you'll open a box and there'll be a handwritten note in the box that will tell you something that Ken thought about it. And this is what Ken thought about the objects on the left. These crude-looking scissors appear to have been made from two nickel-silver Old English pattern tablespoon blanks with wire bows soldered to them. The blade looks quite ingenious with the box joint and holding jaw designed to stop the flower stalk slipping while being cut. Only file marks are visible with no other finishing, suggesting there may have been a cutler or similar who was a keen flower gardener. And there are many allotment holders in Sheffield. This may well be unique. Well, I say I don't think it's unique because I've got a smarter pair made by a company called Robertson Belt, but I haven't had the chance to check in the catalogue whether they've got them down as flower scissors or grape scissors. The common feature was you cut and you held on to the thing. Because if you're just, I suppose if you're taking cut flowers and you cut them and they drop on the floor, you've actually just, you know, destroyed the item that you're trying to pick. And on the right-hand side, we've got a more modern variation. Which again, so I'm sure if you go to your local garden centre, you can probably find something that was put down as being a garden scissors. Glue. You know, there are some things we take for granted. You know, you reach for the araldite or the super glue, and you can imagine that notion when cutlers were basically constantly working, getting paid on a piece rate. So they'd be in this very dirty, scruffy workshop, and they'd certainly have some sort of fire burning all the time. It might be a forge that they'd actually got, might just be a fire for keeping warm because there's clearly no central heating. But one of the things they would have had almost stewing permanently would have been some glue for attaching the handles to the tan. Again, people have heard me talk before saying a knife is no good without a handle. You know, and actually, if the two things are going to come apart, they're actually useless. And it's interesting if you get a hold of old cutlery sometimes, you can see problems have started to occur between where the handle has actually been joined onto the main knife. This was something that was just trying to prevent that process. And it's interesting, you know, the suggestion was this could have been placed over a candle or an oil lamp. It could have sat in a large pot filled with hot water to stop it going solid, or it could have been heated on an oven or a stove. But whatever happened, they had to keep it under control. And it was also, the glue was actually based on animal hide or fish extract. Now, I suspect that would have smelled quite badly. And certainly these workshops would have been a rich taste of the senses, I think, in terms of smoke, dirt, and the smell. And this was actually, we know who owned this. There was a chap called Eddie Chapman, and he was a knife grinder, and he was a little mester. He made pocket knives and surgical. This is one of the favourite things I think that Pete's found here. This is the illustration that I used. If we were to look at a picture of a load of Victorian people piling down the street, many of them would have had hats on, okay? And this is a hat stretcher. So you could actually increase the hat size by a factor of 2, okay? And, if you've got a hat that was made of some soft materials, it was made of straw, it was made of cloth, and essentially, I suppose it's interesting. You can imagine going into a shop, you get a hat out, oh, this is the wrong size, and the chap or lady behind the desk says, oh, I can sort that for you, give it here, put the hat stretcher in, give it a couple of turns, try that, oh no, a bit more, give it a few more turns, And actually, so, an ingenious thing, what is it, where did it come from, why did Ken collect it? Ivory. Sheffield imported, shed loads of ivory. Okay, at a time when, that was, if you like, an acceptable thing to do. So in 1880, 675 tons of ivory, and they often called it elephant's tooth. They didn't always call it ivory, or they called it ivory tooth, was imported into Britain, and 1 ton cost $7,000. So if you were having your handles on an item, then ivory was more expensive than bone. And it was a little bit cheaper, actually, than mother of pearl, but certainly it was a quality item. And if you look at the catalogues of tools or of cutlery, you've got those variable pricing in. But also, there were people in Sheffield who were known as fluters. And their skill was to carve ivory on mother of pearl to turn them into decorative items. And the other thing that you would have found is that sometimes there were waste products that were left over, so nothing would have been wasted. So you'd start off making the big items out of your big bit of elephant tusk, and then slowly you would make smaller items as time actually went on. And it's interesting, obviously, now, you can't sort of buy and sell ivory. If you try taking something to an auction house, my neighbours had a desk, and there was a little bit of ivory inlay, and the auction house wouldn't touch it. The only saving grace, actually, if you're thinking, oh, I've got some ivory I'd like to get rid of, most people can't tell what it is, okay? And if you just said it was bone, you'd actually get away with that. But it is interesting. The other uses for ivory, we've already mentioned the billiard balls. You'd also got piano keys, and obviously you've got cutlery handles. Slight advantage of ivory over the synthetic xylenite is ivory wouldn't catch fire. But, it's quite difficult to tell which item is which. This brought me back to sort of, when I was at school, you did a bit of woodwork and you opened this little cupboard, and there were all these tools neatly laid out, and one of them, somewhere, you would have found a junior hacksaw. Okay, and the one on the right is a bit more modern than that, but it's interesting. Here's one of Sheffield's great tool makers, James Neal. The brand of James Neal was Eclipse, and that was a really significant thing. On the desk there, we've got, in fact, there's 2 of them. One's in a box and one's not, but we've got 2 gold-plated, well, they say the gold-plated, the gold appearance hacksaws. And they were to celebrate, I think it's the 150th anniversary of the company. And it's interesting, there's also a gold Stanley knife there, and that was to celebrate something like 100 years of Stanley. So it's almost saying these companies lasted for a long time, and their quality endured for a significant period. The brand Eclipse, that was only came in 1909, and the company, James Neal, were famous for making hacksaws and magnets. And I suppose it's interesting, the hacksaw end of it, you can visualize the product. The magnet end of it, generally they would have been used in a whole range of industrial applications, and it's not so easy to actually look at that. I also had a look at some of the other things that James Neal made. And I hope we've got some engineers in the room, of which I am not one, because hopefully you might recognize some of these things, because I don't. Bit and butt gauges, instrument vickers, pink chucks, tank and washer cutters, and rammed heads, V-blocks and clamps. So one of the things about the Hawley Collection is also the tools that made the tools. All over this city, we had people who had the skill to fabricate, to make things out of metal, to make a tool, to do a job that needed doing. And that's something else that we forget about. So yes, down in our office, we've got a fabulous display of, maybe 200 footprint tools that are all laid out, but often there would have been that notion of things being made in a specific bespoke way, and Sheffield had the skills to do that, and still has, I think. Another kitchen item, a knife sharp. Yeah, you see, and it probably will find that nearly everybody does it on a slightly different device. And there was a point recently where I was trying to use, I think it was a Bergen and Ball thing, to sharpen some shears in the garden, and I was failing miserably. There's a company in Sheffield that makes butcher steels, and they make 2,000 a week, and they're very busy doing it. It's Eggington's, and it's chefs who actually like that. So we have a number of other devices like this, a whole range of sort of kitchen items that you can use. And this is something from the sort of 1930s. And it was advertised as something that would sharpen stainless steel knives. The knives before stainless steel were probably easier to sharpen and were sharper. If you had, carbon steel, it was something sharper than stainless steel. Actually, one reason why some of the cutlers didn't like stainless steel when it first came out, because it wasn't actually sharp, but of course it didn't go rusty. Yeah, this has found its way into our mystery tool collection, and if any of you went to the Heritage Weekend, we actually had this. We had this out on display. A special vise used to apply tension, tightness to wires, part of an overhead wire system. So generally, somebody doesn't come to put a major, power cable or a telephone cable above your garden, but the people who do that, I mean, apart from the fact you stand back in awe when they just walk up the pole with, a range of devices, but also they had specialist tools, and the wire, there's no point in having a telephone wire that hasn't got the proper tension on it. There's no point in having a guide rope to something if it doesn't have the proper tension on it. So, this was a specific tool to do that. And actually just looking at that tool, well, you could be forgiven for thinking, I've no idea what that's about. But, again, it's one of the wonderful things that was dug out. And the correct name for this item is a draw vise number 2. And I guess if you were a lineman, you knew the difference between what a number 2 would do, what a number 1 would do, and what a number 3 would do. And you weren't going to take no for an answer. Something that people might not realise, we've got a stack of medical equipment in the Hawley Collection. And a few years ago, I was involved in cataloguing some of these items, but we did have a bit of a problem. There's quite a lot of items we didn't know what they were. Fortunately, we have got some catalogues, but you can't always match up an object with a catalogue. So medical diagnostic instruments. Now, these haven't got a maker on them, but they have got the sort of military or government mark on them, which suggests they were probably a standard issue, possibly for doctors stroke nurses who were going into schools. So this is very much the ear, nose and throat department and eye examination. And again, I've no idea if, health professionals now pile into a junior school or a secondary school and get all the class to line up and do something with them all, because certainly I've got memories of those sort of things happening. And non-spark tools. I suppose in some ways, I can't think, when I've been using a tool, I've never thought personally, oh dear, what if it gets a spark? But if you worked in a mine or a place that made ammunition or explosives, the risk of a spark is really something that is quite serious. So these were actually made by a brass company, by brass founders. And again, I suppose, we've got that whole thing about iron and steel in Sheffield, but quite often we don't think about companies that are actually engaged in doing things with brass. So the sort of industries where these would have been important: oil and gas exploration, mines, chemical process, armed forces, bomb disposal, and aviation. And they used non-ferrous metal, which was not usually something that was associated with Sheffield. So these brass founders, they were formed in 1919. And again, some of it's just this notion, isn't it? It's this notion of the skill base in Sheffield of being able to make things out of metal, and also to actually use different materials. And again, it's not something I know a lot about, but that whole range of different alloys, different metals, there's loads of skill there that we've got sort of stacked up. I wanted to put WD-40 on this. This is a caption, but and actually, yeah, I've got one somewhere in my garage. There is one of these that was left by the previous owner. But that, I don't know. You could do that phrase, couldn't you? Oil makes the world go round. So once found in most workshops and homes and used to apply oil, and now it's been replaced by WD-40 oil in an aerosol spray. But you know, whether it's your creaky doors or they did say that these were very popular with Meccano and model train enthusiasts. I think if you're a model train enthusiast, you probably still want to use one of these. You know, go for the authentic thing and not the WD-40. But you know, if you've got your bike out in Derbyshire, I think you'd get a few looks if you got one of these out to do something with it. And of course, this is the 1930s item. It was marked 1/3 of a pint, 14A. And I guess if you'd gone into Ken Hawley's shop, you know, if you'd sold these, you would have had them in a range of different sizes. So if you wanted a 14A, you would have known you wanted a 14A. Now, I hate to say this really, but that was made in Leeds. Ken, what were you doing? I don't know. But it was a company called K's, and so it was patented in Leeds, but maybe Ken sold it in his shop. And they also diversified to make patented door locks for architectural and the railway industry. So painters and decorators theory. Again, it's really great when we've got the box, when we've got the packaging. Company called Oxley's, painters, scrapers. You know, so there's almost an implication here. These are not for Joe Public. You know, these are for the professionals in the trade. And it is interesting, isn't it? There's certain, you know, there's places around Sheffield where the trade will go and get their tools and they'll go and get their paint, which are not necessarily open to the public. Nearly all these boxes will say by the dozen. Whereas and often the things, there's only half a dozen in the box, but they often said by the dozen. It has an issue number on there. And you know, we talked about how do we arrange the Hawley collection. Well, another way we've organised the Hawley collection, if you ever get a tour around our back stores, which I'm certainly very happy to do for people, we've got some of the collection organised by trade. So we've got a barrel maker's trade, we've got the painter's trade, we've got the telephone engineer's trade. We've got the silversmith's trade. So there were specific items for specific trades. And if you were in one of those trades, I guess, you know, you knew the tools and you knew the things you actually wanted. So again, it's interesting, Oxley's were based at the Toronto work. Once you start looking at the names of the works in Sheffield, just like I said, you've got a bit of a problem because, you know, there's a couple of thousand companies. What's your logo going to be? Well, the other thing is, what name are you going to give to your works that helps you sell your product? What might help you sell your product in Canada? Oh, well, we'll call it the Toronto Works then. And actually, if somebody in Canada buys something that says from the Toronto Works, they probably feel quite good about it. So there's quite a lot of, you know, works in Sheffield that did have American words in their title, and particularly thinking, you know, that was something for the American market. This company also made tools for cutting shoe leather, files and rasps. Yeah, and this company was dissolved in 2005, having been acquired by George Barnsley's, which is just around the corner. And sometimes, again, on the internet, you'll see urban explorers have been behind the scenes at George Barnsley's, and there's a nice painted door just around the corner. But, you know, another very specialist item, a quick release aircrew knife. So, you know, if you've had to eject from a plane or jump out with a parachute, well, there's a couple of things. One is to get out the plane in the first place, you might have had to cut a seatbelt. And again, the belt on a pilot is more elaborate than what you would have in a car. So you can imagine the panic if this has actually got to be used. If you're in a plane and you think it's going down, you've got to get yourself out your seatbelt first of all. You're going to jump out with a parachute, and then actually at some point you don't want your parachute actually getting wrapped around a tree or dragging you off into a river or whatever. So a quick release knife. The holsters were actually made by Remploy, but you know, everything was designed so you could get it out quickly. There's other examples of these, and the latter ones actually had rounded ends. We've had a few sort of discussions with people from the Fire Brigade Museum, because these have got quite a collection of them. And obviously the Fire Brigade do still have these knives, because when they go to an accident, if they need to get somebody out of the seatbelt, they'll have a knife of this sort that they can actually use. So, you know, quick release aircrew knife, but again, a specialist knife. But you know, if a Sheffield company got an order from the military, from the RAF, from every fire brigade in the country, it would have been a good order. And actually, that probably would have been nice, steady business. I mean, Sheffield stuff went all over the world, okay? And to some extent, there was probably a bit of an issue that says if somebody somewhere needed something, Sheffield could design them an item that would do the bill. So this, you know, rubber tapping knife, all right? It's funny, I was sort of thinking, you know, you don't often see rubber tapping on telly anymore. You know, and I know some things that, you know, there's a bit of a sense of rubber's been replaced by synthetic with many things, but actually I think we'll still probably find there's quite a lot of uses of rubber. And so, you know, but they don't do it in Derbyshire, I don't think. So, you know, you're talking about the Amazon, you're talking about Southeast Asia, you're talking about Africa. And some of Sheffield's prominent companies, Joseph Rogers, who were possibly, you know, the most prominent cutlery company, but they also made essentially rubber tapping knives, tools, you know, Fenton Brothers and William Jackson. In 1900, 40,000 tons of rubber were being used mainly in the car industry. I know that's saying the 1900s are actually 1900, but, you know, it was a huge, significant industry. And, you know, you can imagine somebody in Malaysia is tapping a tree and the tool in their hand, they think, oh, that's Sheffield. So it was pretty good advertising that the name Sheffield was going out there all over the world. Surgeoning, trepanning instruments. A set of instruments used to cut a section of bone out of a human skull known as trepanning. I'm going to give that health warning now. If you don't want, if you're of a nervous disposition, don't listen. Instruments include elevator for lifting the bone disc out of a hole, a bone gouge for cutting and extracting bone, a button-ended lenticular with a smooth end to depress the brain and a sharp end to trim the edges of the perforation, a 5-sided sharp scraper for scraping bone or tissue, a handle, a cranial forceps for removing the bone disc, an arrowhead perforator, a trephine heads for cutting into the bone, a saw handle. Okay, so, you know, again, it's that notion of sort of specialist items being made. And, you know, there are still companies in Sheffield that are making surgical instruments. Sometimes the view of surgical instruments is once they often used to say this with hip joints, that if they'd come into contact with any bodily fluids, you could never use it again. You know, it was something that you weren't going to be able to use again. So I don't know, just there's a whole issue about making these things, designing them, and then cleaning them. Interesting, you know. It almost looks like a presentation case. Is that what you gave to the surgeon when they're retired? We're going to give you a set of tools that you can put in a box and you can put in the attic. But, you know, I guess again, you know, it could have been medical people who travelled between different institutions. There is a massive collection of surgical instruments in the Thackeray Museum in Leeds, and actually Sheffield University's got some items of like a sort of medical history, and there maybe is something together where. Different people who hold elements of surgical instruments that were made in Sheffield, they're not in a single collection. And again, if you're interested in that, you probably have to work quite hard between different. We haven't really touched on anything, but, you know, you could loosely call this ephemera. So we've got a whole category of things that are ephemera, and we've got boxes of ephemera related to different industries. And this is ephemera related to the trade unions. And it's funny because I'm looking at my next talk now, and I'm going to do one about a company called Warden Payne. And I've read the history in Tweedale, and basically it was a battle between the people who own the company and the workers. There's all sorts of issues about the regulations around the Cutler's Company, the regulations about cutlery companies, and the unions, which were quite strong in Sheffield, trying to negotiate the best deal for the workers, basically. And on the left, we've got basically the record of what people had made. And on the right, we've got the sort of document that is sort of that sort of agreement. And I guess, you know, this would have been the days when somebody handed out pay packets on a Friday afternoon. And probably if you got there and you thought, well, I know what I made this week, and you're not getting the money that matches up to that, you've got scope for a dispute with your employers. So there's a whole load of information that we've actually got, and some of these things nobody will really have done any real in-depth work with them. So if you ever want to do a PhD in trade union studies and disputes between Sheffield companies and firms, you could come and help us and sort of delve into the Hawley Collection. Upholstery. An upholstery webbing stretcher used to stretch and secure webbing onto a furniture frame. And it sort of suggests really that people don't do a lot of upholstery at home, doesn't it? It's it's one of those things. I think probably sometime in your life you've tried to repair a bit of a chair or something and thought this isn't as easy as I thought it was. Well, this is the tool for doing it. The other thing that was mentioned in the write-up that Pete's done here was the mention about tax. You know, whatever happened to tacks, the humble tack? You know, that was something that, you know, you'd whack the stair carpet in with it, you'd go all the way around. But again, if you've got a really nice classic bit of furniture, and obviously you see people on telly doing these bits of furniture, something like this, a specialist tool to do a specialist job. And you know, I know I went past somewhere the other day that was on South Road at Walkley, and there's a place there that does furniture restoration and upholstery, and maybe you should knock on the door and say, have you got one of these? And hopefully they would know what it is. Well, here we are, you know, back to the medical instruments. We've got loads of gynecological instruments in the Hawley collection, and again, some of them were things that we wouldn't recognise. When people are in childbirth having an examination, probably the last thing they are bothered about thinking about is what is the instrument that the surgeon or the doctor is actually using. But you know, we have these things in the collection. This was pre-1930 because it's not made of stainless steel. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? That whole range. You know, how many different items would a surgeon actually have in their sort of suite of their suite of sort of tools and instruments to be able to perform a whole range of operations? So again, that's something we've got in the collection. You can see as we got to this end of the alphabet, it starts to get a bit more challenging. But another pair of, well, I nearly said another pair of scissors, but not the shears. Okay. Cutlery again, because they cut. But these were weavers' shears, and I think also people who do needlework, craft things. So they're sort of easy to use. You know, and actually these were made by William Whiteley. So plug for a local company that is still going. If you want to get a present for you know, some relative or your children, get them a pair of kitchen scissors from William Whiteley. They're not cheap, but they'll last them a lifetime. You know, really good sort of product. So, you know, it's nice really to have a company that's still sort of making things. We've also got Ernest Wright, who's still making things, located in almost the same place. And there's a lady called Grace Horn who makes very specialist scissors. And I think, so these were designed because they were easy to hold, self-opening with a spring action. An interesting shape. You know, the first time I bought a pair of these, I didn't really know what they were for, and I had to have a look at that. X was a bit of a challenge on the alphabet. So the Acto craft knife. You know, these were really great for modelers, architects, craftspeople to do things with. And it's interesting actually because there's a bit of a sort of Sheffield connection here. So in the early 70s, they approached Footprint Tools, I've mentioned earlier, and another Sheffield company that's still going, to make a retractable blade with a plastic handle. And the oil crisis made the price of plastic too expensive, so it wasn't economically viable. But instead, Footprint Tools made their own number 51 handy knife. They're a company we have a very close association with, and so we've got lots of their stuff. Yankee screwdriver. Yeah. An American design widely used prior to the introduction of power tools. You know, you could write that for, you know, 20 or 30 items, couldn't you? Used widely before the introduction of power tools. Designed in the late 19th century, introduced by Stanley Tools in the early 1950s. You know, the last talk, and some people here I know, was on Stanley Tools. And I suppose there's quite a sense of, you know, lots of these things were made in Sheffield, but Stanley Tools would have had a warehouse here, and they were very popular before the use of electric drills. Again, that same sort of notion. So this was actually made in Germany in 1987, but sold as Stanley Tools Sheffield. And again, that question, when do we stop collecting? Generally, when somebody turns up at the door with some tools for us, they generally tend to be not the brand new models that they've never been taken out of the packaging. They tend to be a little bit rusty and well used around the edges. But essentially, if we haven't already got one, we'll say, yes, we'll have it. If we can't afford, in terms of space, we can't afford to duplicate things. But sometimes people offer us something and it's better than the one we've got in the collection. So again, we have to go round that loop and do some preparation about that. It's fair to say when they were preparing this talk, they were stumped on Z. Okay? And they'd use ChatGPT and all that sort of stuff. And I said, what about Zachariah Belcher? And they said, what about Zachariah Belcher? Anyway, they looked on our index and we did have an item by Zachariah Belcher. Now, in the display, we've actually got a small boot in there, but I actually thought it looked better without the small boot. But I've got a slightly stronger interest in this because one of my friend's surname is Belcher. And actually, she is a descendant of this company. And this guy came from Birmingham to Sheffield, and he was a skilled rule maker. And sometimes these things would have been inlaid with brass, sometimes would have been inlaid with ivory, sometimes would have been inlaid with bone. And